So welcome to the third class of the principles of democracies and why they fail. We sped briefly through book 8 of Plato's Republic. I'm just going to very quickly summarize an aspect that we didn't look at, which will help us to understand his characterization more broadly. But I did mention that Plato has Socrates put forward a proposal about the characteristics of the human psyche, which is to say that the human psyche basically is desire. So the human being, to be a human being, is to be open to a world in the element of desire. And we have three basic desires or propensities in Socrates' view in this teaching. And they tend towards either knowing or the use of the intellect, to indignation or the love of honor, and the bodily desires. And there's no such thing as a simply bodily desire, but we can leave aside all the complexities at this moment. Now, in this mythological understanding of the political regime that Socrates propounds, the first regime, which is aristocracy, which means literally the rule of the aristoi, the best, the rule of the best. They are people whose intellect leads their love of honor, which rules their desires. And that's the best condition of the individual psyche, and that's the best condition of the city. The second best is when that degrades to a teamocracy. So a teamocracy means the rule of those who love honor, or the rule of honor, literally. And people who are dominated by the love of honor would therefore have spiritedness, or the love of honor, as the ruling element within their psyche. And that's followed by desire. So what Socrates tries to uncover in this first declension from the best form of city, he says it's a teamocracy, but they secretly love wealth. So on the one hand, they have the aristocratic disregard for wealth, but on the other hand, they hoard it. Right? And then bodily desire. They have control over their bodily desire, and that's why they can make good soldiers and so forth. Then the democracy declines to an oligarchy, and they are ruled by desire, and because all desires require money, but they are also, second, governed by their reason in the form of the rationality of calculation, and then last of all is the love of honor, because they're willing to trade and do other things that the teamocrat would disdain to do. And then we get to the democrat. First in the democrat is desire, just like the oligarch. So the way he expresses this mythologically is that a democracy comes into being out of an oligarchy because the oligarch's son loses the tempering of the bodily desires that the oligarch has, with his rational in the low sense, focus upon making money. And so he desires all things. And on the other, below that is the love of honor. So he desires all things, and that leads to the notion that all desires are equal, and you can't judge. You should not be judgmental. And indignation arises when someone does try to differentiate between the desires, or say that this way of life is better than that way of life, and so forth. And then last is reason. That's also the same characterization of the tyrant. Desire first, indignation, love of honor second, and then reason. Reason is purely an instrument of the first two passions. Now, the qualification that Socrates is making in presenting this myth is that philosophy only appears in the democratic stage, first point, and second point, and he identifies their activity with exactly what can happen in the democracy. And secondly, I did point out, if you look at the opening of the myth, he makes this comparison. He mentions the four of the 5 ages that Hesiod talks about in the works of days, where we descend from the golden, silver, bronze, and iron age. But he misses the age of heroes, which would be the 4th of the 5, and that would match democracy. So he is obliquely indicating to us that there are aspects of democracy that are essential to human excellence. So democracy does 2 things. It degrades our ability to distinguish between a better and a worse way of life. And that's of the essence of human excellence. On the other hand, it allows for the freedom that is the condition for genuine human excellence in philosophy. But that means that there's a tension between what's good for philosophy, for the highest human achievement, and what's good for the city, which is more lawfulness and less chaos, more judgment about desires, and so on. So Plato presents this has Socrates present this as a problem. We get a more fully articulated system of regimes and what's better and worse in them with Aristotle, as we'll see shortly. But I just thought I'd touch on how the psychology matches the regimes in Plato, and to see if anyone has any questions.
Martin, just one quick, it's a smallish point, I think. So most people think of democracy starting in ancient Greece around about the year 500 or so. So when you said before that in Plato's view, you need democracy for philosophy to come on the scene, is that sort of suggesting that what came prior to Socrates, the pre-Socratics, is sort of not philosophy? Because as far as I
wouldn't go that far. So it's definitely, he's presenting it's a myth, but within that myth, he is suggesting that a certain loosening of the traditional morality is necessary for philosophy to arise, and that loosening is fundamentally political. And this is what happened in the Greek world. We had we could call them republics, and that was some kind of mix of democracy and oligarchy, or aristocracies and democracies, and that occurred only in the Greek world. And it reached its fully articulated form in Aristotle, and it reached its most radical, practical example in the city of Athens, where you ended up by the late 5th century, you pick your jurors by lot, you pick everything by lot except for generals, and then you elect them.
Do you need democracy for philosophy to arise or for it to flourish?
Well, democracy both allows for and undermines philosophy, because philosophy it consists in distinguishing better from worse, like to know the truth and distinguish that from what's false, to know what is truly noble and what seems to be noble and just and good, and so on and so forth. So philosophy consists in making true distinctions, to be a bit reductive. So democracy both undermines that by demanding that you think that all choices and all desires are equal, but it also allows it to occur because the power of the traditional single answer to each of those questions is loosened to a degree that allows questioning. The problem is that there is a difference between questioning. The one form of questioning is, okay, so I have 3 opinions about what is just, and therefore I am urgently impelled towards the question, what is justice? And the other way of looking at that, which is our answer today, is there are 3 positions about what is just. That's because there is no justice, and that's your truth, and this is my truth. And that means I have no desire to search for the truth, because I've made some kind of, theoretically incoherent, but relativistic assumption about what the truth is. but so democracy both allows for that and it undermines philosophy by demanding that all desires be equal in Socrates' view. Naturally, I don't endorse any of these remarks. No, so democracy and various kinds of republics that weren't democratic in our terms, but were that, and political life, in a sense, appeared with philosophy and science together in ancient Greece, and along with comedy and tragedy first. And I don't think these are coincidental. They are all aspects of a similar thing, but philosophy is so comprehensive that it cannot be tied to any particular history, culture, political arrangement, and it has occurred and flourished in certain individuals in every kind of regime. It's a human possibility, but as Socrates says, if you want to search for the best regime, it's easier to do it in a democracy than it is in other forms of regime. So that presents us with a problem, a tension between the highest and what's healthy for a city. And Aristotle goes some way to trying to resolve that in the politics. And ultimately, if you look at the book as a whole, his resolution is something in accord with what Plato was suggesting. His resolution is book 7 and 8 of the Politics, which is about education. So the proper moral and civic education will produce the right citizen body, but it will also be open to philosophy at its peak. And that's what Aristotle intends. Now, the middle will be tragedy, the middle of his education. Between the peak and the elementary learning of letters, it is tragedy. And this is why I think that it's not a coincidence that tragedy, democracy, and or republic, republics of a certain kind, and philosophy occur together historically. Now, so was there anything else about Aristotle's discussion? About Plato's discussion from last week that I could address? I have produced a handout which I'll put on Dropbox and send around after this class, just articulating the chapters from Aristotle that we're going to look at. Now, what would be best, if I have the text up or if I have the summary? There are 3 chapters that well, the 2 chapters that I said we'll look at closely. We'll read all of them together. I might summarize the first chapter and then bring the text up for the second chapter. Okay, so in the first chapter, I've just reorganized the way in which he presents his argument and made it somewhat simpler. Yeah, 3 or 4 sentences in, he says that everyone does everything because of what they think, what is in their opinion, good. So human beings desire what is good and they act on their opinion as to what is good. And that's another oblique justification of philosophy, because we would like that opinion to be knowledge. So therefore, political communities, which are human constructions, aim at some good, like any other human construction. And his argument is that the political community aims at the most authoritative good, which comprehends all the other individual goods that human beings seek. And I recommend going to the second chapter of the first book of the Ethics. And what Aristotle says there is that the political community aims at the most authoritative good because it orders what we should do and what we shouldn't do. That is, it tells us what is good and what is bad. And all of the activities and sciences lead up to the authoritative political sciences like generalship or the art of rhetoric. And I think that remains true for any political community. And it remains true for every political community that it orders what sciences are to be pursued, by whom, and how far. This is an Aristotelian phrase. And that's also true, even in our very different time where science itself and the political community have been reordered so as to be more in alignment. We still, there are fruitful studies that are now no longer pursued whatsoever. And there are dangerous studies, for example, fiddling about with bat viruses that are pursued at great expense, and so on. So the political authority determines what will be pursued, to what degree, and by whom. Now that's just a beginning point, because ultimately at the peak, there's a divergence between the political art and philosophy, but that's where we begin. Now, then we have in the second book of the Politics, a chapter that is really fundamental for all of political philosophy. And this chapter and chapter 6 of book 3, I think are extremely important for understanding the difference between classical and modern philosophy. So we'll spend some time looking at passages from there. And then next week, when we shift abruptly to modern political philosophy, having ignored 1,800 years of thought, we'll be looking at people who are directly opposing the thought that Aristotle expresses in book 1, chapter 2, and book 3, chapter 6. And those thoughts are as follows. 1, the human being is by nature political or flourishes in a political community. And 2, there is a difference between a good and a bad regime, as opposed to a legitimate and an illegitimate one. And we'll come to that next week. So let's have a look at a couple of passages from book 1, chapter 2. I'm just going to change the text where. Okay, so this is book 1. I've just discussed chapter 1 briefly. Now, chapter 2. There are some remarks here on the method of philosophy, which unfortunately we don't have time to pursue. But essentially what he's doing is beginning with the basic elements of the political community, and then he looks at the end of the political community. So in Aristotelian terms, the material and efficient cause, and then he looks at the formal and final cause. Now, what's odd is he says we look to the elements first, which is not, I don't know if that's characteristically as Aristotelian. In fact, I'm convinced it's the opposite. So that would, but what he is doing, he's going to lead up to the argument that the human being is by nature political. So he begins with the elements that are irreducibly natural in human beings, and they are male and female, because without male and female being together or in community, then there is no continuation of the human species. And he says, as an aside, in this translation, that as with all other animals and plants, human beings have a natural striving, leave behind another that is like oneself. And he says this in other places too, that there is a natural desire to leave behind another, and he uses a slightly different expression, that is, well, one wishes to live on in form, if not in number. That is, you, numerically one person, will pass away, but you can leave behind another like yourself in form. Now, and this is something that Aristotle shares with Plato. It's given a much more poetic dimension in the Symposium, but it's essentially the same teaching, that anything that lives wants to reproduce itself and then it passes away and it lives on in the thing that it produces. Now, for both Plato and Aristotle, the thing that you produce that lives on after you and that represents you is only on one level children. On the next level, it's great works of art for Plato, and the works of political legislation or founding, more for Aristotle, that leaves behind a way of life informed by your psyche. So there are two levels of reproduction of what is like oneself that live on after you. Okay, so that as an aside. Okay, so there's two forms of community that are necessary for life, male and female, and that which masters and that which serves. Now, I'm trying to reproduce in English what Aristotle does in Greek. He does not say master and slave. And this is very important for his teaching, because he's going to say that if you don't have a ruling element and an obeying element, you won't be able to produce the necessities of life. Now, that means when he comes to evaluate actual slavery, as it is practiced in all human cities, he then has a natural standard, and nature is always the principle. And so the natural standard for slavery would be as follows. There would have to be someone who would benefited by being ruled, and therefore they'd have to not be able to rule themselves. They would have to not have the appropriate cognitive capacity to direct themselves to their own health and well-being, and they would benefit by being directed by another. And so that's a very brief sketch, but this is what he comes to as the natural standard for slavery. And then he says, where you don't have that, where people aren't benefited by being slaves, then it's by force or law, or that is convention, by convention and violence, and it's not just. So that means that he's provided a standard by which you can condemn all actual slavery, but he doesn't advertise that. You have to figure it out. Okay, so there are these two natural kinds of community that provide the basis for life, the necessities for life. And from them, you get from the household with these two elements of community, you then get a village. And in Aristotle's description, this is a fairly barbaric existence. Actually, I should just say, to accompany the suggestion about whether or not slavery is just or natural, he makes the remark that by nature, females are not slaves, right? And it's a mistake that barbarians make to treat women like slaves. And he says, this is why the poets say it is fitting for Greeks to rule barbarians, the assumption being that barbarian and slave are by nature the same thing. So the barbarians, for example, the Persians, are themselves slave because they're all slave to one master, the great king of Persia. And in that condition, they are unable to identify the free character of women, and they treat women like slaves. Now, the response by anyone with a modicum of historical knowledge is to say, but women in Greece weren't treated as freely as male citizens. They're not in public, they can't vote, they can't go into the law courts by themselves, etc., etc. And that might lead you to look at the origin of that quote. It is fitting for Greeks to rule barbarians. And that's said by Iphigenia when she's about to be sacrificed on Aulis so that the Greek fleet can leave for Troy to appease Artemis, and the Greek fleet can leave for Troy and return Helen. Now, child sacrifice would have to be close to the peak barbarism, and Aristotle is making an ironic comment about the character of the Greeks to discern the difference between a free person and a slave person. There's a couple of quotes from Greek poets in this first book. There's a couple of quotes that are put in the mouths, as this one is, that come from the mouths of women protagonists in Greek tragedies, which tell against the grain of the text. Now, I just bring this one to your attention. Okay, so from these,
just by the way, Martin, it's just do you recall where that statement by Iphigenia is? Which book? Which I think it's in a drama, right?
Yeah, I believe it's Iphigenia in Aulis by Euripides.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Right. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting. He uses Euripides, not Sophocles or Aeschylus.
And an opera by Gluck.
Correct. Okay, so Aristotle says about the earliest communities that arrive out of the family, as that is, these small, I guess, tribal villages. He says this is what Homer meant when he said that each acts as law to his children and wives. So the small villages tend to be dominated by a village chieftain, say. For men are scattered and used to dwell in this manner in ancient times. And it's for this reason that all assert that the gods are under a king, because they themselves are under kings now or were in ancient times. So he's saying the reason why Homer and Hesiod make Zeus a ruler by force of the other Olympian gods, including his own wife, who I think he throws off Olympus at one point. I know he throws Hephaestus, who falls from heaven and makes a large dent in the earth. He threatens to throw Hera off. Anyway, and so on. So he's obviously a violent, tyrannical ruler. And Aristotle's hermeneutic remark is that's because they lived in the time of the kind of kings that I mean. And when he says each acts as a law to his children and wives, that's a quote about the, who's the giant with one eye? The Cyclops that Odysseus has to escape from his cave.
Polyphemus.
So, yeah, Polyphemus. And Polyphemus is a cannibal or eats human beings alive and brutally. So he's exaggerating, well, not exaggerating, but he's trying to, he is suggesting that these initial communities are quite barbaric, and so there is a progress. Right? And then for him, this progress has a natural fulfillment. So at number 8 here, the complete community, political community, arising from several villages is the city. It reaches a level of self-sufficiency, so to speak, and this is an important phrase, and while coming into being for the sake of living, it exists for the sake of living well. So a number of villages come together, begin to intermarry and so on, because it's to their advantage. They can make more food, they can defend themselves better. So it comes into being for the sake of mere self-preservation, for living. But it is, in his view, the city is, its being is that it provides for human excellence and happiness, for the sake of living well. So he then says, every city, therefore, exists by nature, if the first communities are. So now he's not saying that, okay, the family is natural and therefore the city is natural. He's saying, if this growth is natural from the family to the city, if that's a natural growth, it has a natural end, and the city is the end, and nature is an end. And then he says, what each thing is, for example, a human being, a horse, or a household, when its coming into being is complete, is, we assert, the nature of that thing. So, and this is extremely typical Aristotelian thought. You do not understand horses by looking at a lame horse or a young horse or a badly trained horse. You look at a horse in its maturity when it's at its best. And that allows you to understand every other kind of horse because they're defective in various ways. Same with a human being. You understand what a human being is by looking at what an excellent human being is, and you can make various subtractions to get down to us, to me anyway. And so understanding depends upon understanding the best kind, the best configuration of a thing, and that allows you to understand the various ways in which something is not the best. Okay. So that for the sake of which a thing exists or the end is what is best, and self-sufficiency is an end and what is best in a political community. And he means self-sufficient in not in having enough wheat, but self-sufficient as being able to establish and maintain those human institutions or opinions or convictions or pastimes or practices that allow people to be happy and excellent. And so I will read this next paragraph because it's an extremely famous one in the history of political thought, and it's one from which the beginnings, the moderns, take their departure in establishing their own thought. So, from these things, it is evident then that the city belongs among the things that exist by nature. Now, that looks odd. What is the thing that is not natural? Well, it's all these tall buildings and this pollution and the fact that we've had to tear things out of the earth to produce our food. What looks like the anti-natural thing is the city. But his claim is that, yes, these modifications of nature, distortions of what is naturally given in the material sense, are the fulfillment of human nature, and that makes them natural. Yeah. So is that an intelligible point? Does anyone have any query or refutation or suggestion?
I don't have a refutation, but it's indicative of the notion that human nature has a kind of transcending element, that human beings by their nature kind of go in excess of nature. And you can, this is sort of talked about a lot by Heidegger, of course. And
well, that's where I want to differentiate, because he is saying this is nature. There's no transcending nature. The aspiration is natural. That is nature. Yeah. So here is that. I haven't explained this very well. Okay. So, but if we begin from the point of view of the fact that the construction of a city, the tearing up of the noble, elegant forest, the planting of the wheat, the training of animals, all the materials, the artifacts, the artificial laws which are made by human beings, all of this seems to be peak artifice, not peak nature. But he is saying, yes, this artifice and this making and this construction completes our natural aspiration. So it's not transcending nature, it is reaching our natural end, because it's intended to allow people to live excellently and happily. Is that?
Can I just test that, Martin? I mean, why are the tangible structures of the city? Surely the city is the community, the relationships between the people, and the intangible institutions by which they live, not the buildings and the skyscrapers and the bridges and the fences.
Yes. What I was trying to bring out by including that within the institutions is that they are just as much constructions. Human constructions there, and that's why we use the word institution, like the legal institution, political institution that's been made. I mean, because they both come from this word that in Greek and Latin means to make, to stand. So someone has constructed this institution or this law that we then live by. And so from the modern point of view, that does look like nature versus artifact, and that's how we often see that. But the classical view is that an artifact can be the completion of a natural potential.
But aren't the moderns misrepresenting what Aristotle says by focusing on the artifacts? They're byproducts, collateral.
Well, so their argument begins by denying that we are reaching a natural end in our community. We are satisfying our natural ends by forming a political community to preserve ourselves from violent death and so on. But yeah, but that's why exactly they take their departure from this paragraph, that they're not completing a natural end. And then Rousseau says, well, if that's the case, then our genuine happiness will always be in tension with our civilization. And that poses a problem that we have not solved. philosophically, if we accept the modern premise. But the argument I would make is that we ought not to accept that premise.
But also, Martin, like I'm not sure if it was last week or in a previous course, but in these courses, it's often said that there's a marked distinction between nature and convention. But of course, even though human beings by nature live in cities, the cities differ from one another as you move from continent to continent. So even though they are natural in that there's no isolated individual who grows up as a hermit, these cities themselves differ markedly, and they are marked by the various distinctions. Yeah.
Don't those various distinctions stem from the nature that is there, in terms of you're in colder places, you're going to have, bigger, thicker buildings, and in warmer places isn't that reflective of the nature?
That's definitely reflective. And Aristotle mentions this later, that if you're going to have, in the case of our objective study, a democracy, it will depend upon the character of the people, which will depend upon their what we would call the natural environment. Do they engage mainly in agriculture because the land is beneficial for that, or are they herds people or whatever? And is it hot or cold, and so on? Do you have to spend all your time building igloos? I mean, these things determine the kind of, well, they don't determine, but they limit the kind of political institutions you can have. So, but from Aristotle's point of view, and I'm just repeating what I've said in a different way, and I'm hope to make it more clear as we go. Those are all the conditions for a political community, right? The natural conditions. The natural end is laws and practices that help people become excellent and happy. So nature is being used in this dual sense. Perhaps I should have set this out. Maybe I'll set this out next week, because I don't want to get away from reading more Aristotle. But one way of understanding the difference between ancient and modern thought per se is Aristotle says there are four causes of a thing, the elements that make it up: the material cause, the origin of the motion that brings into being, often called the efficient cause. So, for example, the artisan who makes an artifact. They are the source of the motion that makes these elements into a shoe, right? And then there's the formal cause, which is the character of the thing, which is an implement designed to protect your foot. And then there's the end, which is that you have sound feet, right? And the end and the form are obviously aspects of each other. Now, so one way of understanding the history of human thought is that, well, instead of these four causes of a thing, the only two that really count are the material and the efficient causes. And the formal and the final, they're just things that we project upon things. They're not natural. They're human constructions. And you can find that from Descartes through to Nietzsche. But that is it. I mean, I don't want to just, I haven't introduced this notion of the causes. So I don't want to complicate things more than I already have.
Could you not then argue, according to the moderns, that a bird's nest is unnatural, if you're dismissing the second two?
Yeah, so this is one interesting thing in biology. So for Aristotle, there's a clear, as we'll see very shortly, there's a clear gradation between the animals and human beings. And then human beings are quite distinct in the character of the mind that they have. But in other respects, there's a gradation. And when he's about to say here that human beings are more political animals, we're not the only political animal, right? Now, in modernity, there's a real problem with biology, because all animals apparently are meant to act just on instinct. And so if some of them make artifacts like birds' nests and beavers make dams and so on, all of a sudden people will say, well, maybe given that human beings aren't differentiated by having a mind, that's just having a better cognitive instrument to our animal passions, then that means we're not really distinct from beavers or birds. And it causes all kinds of confusion, because this notion that things have ends and artifacts are means to those ends has been eliminated by that notion of nature. But that notion of nature has been incredibly powerful in physics and in the associated disciplines such as engineering. So it looks as if that's the truth. And so biology keeps trying to ground itself on an understanding of nature in which there are no ends. And it keeps failing. And every year there's a conference about whether or not we can do this. But I once went to a couple. It was amusing.
Did you have some fun?
Yes. There was 3 of us Aristotelians and 97 reductive mechanical Darwinists. And yeah.
Did you get thrown out on day 1 or day 2?
I was chair of the panel, so they couldn't throw me out. So I could pick the questions. I'm joking. Okay, so where are we? So back into this paragraph. From these things, it is evident that the city belongs among the things that exist by nature. So even though the essence of the city are the opinions and convictions that hold it together and the relations between people. Is that by nature, or is that what we would now call culture? It grows up. From Aristotle's point of view, it is by nature, because nature can be an end, as he said above. He who is without a city through nature rather than chance is either a mean sort or superior to man, right? If you're a human being with human characteristics, then you really need a city to reach your fulfillment. And he characterizes that as without clan, without law, without hearth, like the person reproved by Homer. For the one who is such by nature has by this fact a desire for war, as if he were an isolated piece in a game of backgammon. Backgammon didn't actually exist. It's a different kind of game, but in any case. So and this is interesting when we get to Hobbes, because Hobbes is saying by nature, we're not political. Nature dissociates. It sends us apart because we're competing over the same goods. Aristotle is saying the opposite. Nature associates us. And both Hobbes and Aristotle agree. If by nature we were isolated, we would be at war with one another by nature. And that's what Hobbes says. The state of nature is a state of war, of all against all. And that's the basis for Locke, and therefore for modern liberal democracy. Okay, completely on this one aspect, the ancients and the moderns are diametrically opposed, and you can see that clear difference. So then he says that man is the human being. It's anthropos. I don't know why Kahn's Lord is translating this as man, because we want man for aneb, which means a man who might fight and so on. But that man is much more a political animal than any kind of bee or any herd animal is clear. And he's going to show why he thinks that's clear. So I just note that it is a comparative term. A bee and a herd animal, they're political animals. They are animals that somehow have a community. You know how people talk about dolphins talking to one another and so on. For as we assert, nature does nothing in vain, and the human being alone among the animals has logos, which you can translate as speech or reason or argument. So he begins from the fully formed character of a thing. He doesn't say, what are human beings in their origin? Well, to quote Rousseau, they were savage, what does he say? Stupid brutes, who don't have language and live in a solitary life. No, you look at the fully formed human being who lives in a civilized society and that has been brought up in decent laws and so on. And that person has language by which they can express their thought about typically human things and not just pleasure and pain like an animal can with its voice. And that's what he says here. So, for as we assert, nature does nothing in vain, and therefore, if by nature human beings have speech, that makes us particularly able to share in a community, because we can share in opinions about what's just and unjust. Ultimately, we can share in opinions about what's true and false and philosophize together. And therefore, because that is natural and that is human perfection, the political community, even though it's always more or less just, has some justification from the point of view of philosophy. Okay, I will quickly read this. So the voice indicates the painful and the pleasant. and hence is present in other animals as well. For their nature has come this far that they have a perception of the painful and pleasant and signal these things to one another. And if you have a pet, they signal it to you as well. My cat signals that it's hungry by biting my elbow. I don't know. You have similar means of rhetoric wrought by your pets upon you. But speech serves to reveal the advantageous and the harmful, and hence also the just and the unjust. So there is something by nature good and bad, beneficial and harmful for human beings. And our laws about that, our convictions about that, give us our notions of justice, or depend upon a notion of justice that is a instrument to those goods. For it is peculiar to man, the human being, compared to the other animals, that he alone has a perception of good and bad, and just and unjust, and other things of this sort. And community in these things is what makes a household and a city. Now, he is focusing on the element, the household, that is still present in the political community. And he's excluding the other kinds of community, village and nation, right? Because they're not the peak. If you've become a nation from being a city, there are certain political possibilities and certain human possibilities that he thinks are now out of your reach. With so many people, you're going to have a kind of rule that's going to be more monarchical or more tyrannical or more oligarchical, and it's not going to be able to allow you to participate in political excellence to the same degree as a city. Okay. Now he's going to say that the city is prior to the household and to the individual, but that's qualified. It's prior in one sense, but it's not prior in the other, because the city is an instrument of the happiness of the individuals. It may be prior to the individual in that it aims at more people's excellence and happiness, but it's not simply prior, and that's a point he makes elsewhere. I think that's probably enough for Book 1, Chapter 2, which, as I say, it's
Just on that,
yeah.
prior, I took it is superior, not earlier in time.
Correct.
Right.
So he does appear to be saying here that it's prior in importance. And in Chapter 3 of Book 1 of the Ethics, he says a very similar thing. He says, the point is that people have become excellent, virtuous, or happy. That's the end. But if you can achieve that on the level of a city, that's more divine and noble than simply on the level of an individual. But he never says that the individual is a tool of the state, of the city. Because the whole point of the city is to produce individuals who are happy and excellent. And so in modernity, we tend to get this bifurcation. Either the city is entirely for the sake of the individual, and that's what a liberal democracy, it's meant to be an instrument, or the individual is purely a tool of the state. For the good of the state. And we tend to veer between those two. And that's because we don't have this notion of the individual fulfillment in a species-specific excellence. Okay, so that's Book 1, Chapter 2. I'm happy. If there's any more other questions, I'll go back to my summary. But please speak up if I've no doubt have gone through that quite quickly.
Martin,
Yeah.
you just said something about individual expression of a species-wide excellence or something. Could you just, the last sentence you said, could you just expand on that, please?
Yeah, so that his justification in that paragraph is saying that the human being is by nature a political animal. That is an animal that flourishes in a polis. His justification for that is our capacity for speech. Now, that's a capacity that every human being has potentially, but he doesn't think that the political community is going to be a universal global one. And he doesn't think that not because they didn't have the internet, but because he thinks that the potential to have the political virtues like justice, courage, self-control, that those virtues are most fulfilled in a political community of a certain size, one in which you don't know everyone else is a citizen, but you know someone who knows someone, maybe who knows someone. So reputation is very important, but also you have a capacity to judge many of the individuals whom you come into contact with. And that's not possible on the size of either a large nation or globally. So he thinks, so it's the capacity is species specific, the capacity for speech and therefore of judging about what's just and unjust, good and bad and noble and base. But the peak of that is a community of a certain size. Does that?
Yes, thank you. But I have another question.
Yes, there are many.
Right. You were talking a little while back about the city being natural because a city is built out of human nature, I think. So what did the Greeks regard as supernatural, and what was the boundary between natural and supernatural?
That's a large question. So let me stick to Aristotle for a moment, and then I can talk more broadly. But as I noted in that beginning of that second chapter, when Aristotle says the reason why Homer and Hesiod make Zeus a kind of tyrant over all of the other gods, who are all of his either they are his wife or his children, right? And that's peak barbarism. Incest and cannibalism, the two marks of barbarism that Aristotle picks out for particular criticism at the end of chapter 2. So he is rejecting the entire Greek self-understanding. Right? Now he's subtle about that to varying degrees, and Plato too. He does the same in books 2 and 3 of the Republic. So we need to very carefully distinguish what the philosophers think from what the Greeks in general think. So in the case of Aristotle, the human beings, nature is not just a thing out of which we build something, it's that towards which we are building something. So the city is not just designed to protect our animal nature, protect ourselves from the frost and the rain and so on. It's designed to fulfill through opinions, discourse, political argument, and so on. It's designed to fulfill a human potential to show excellence in the political and the philosophical arenas. So therefore, in that context, nothing is transcending nature. It's a fulfillment of a nature. In the metaphysics, in Book Lambda, there is a discussion of what is the first cause of nature. And that appears to be something that transcends nature in this sense, but that would take us off on a different path. At the moment, it's purely within nature. Now, we look back at, say, the Greek gods and say, well, when we say two things, these are the supernatural beings of the Greeks. On the other hand, we say they're anthropomorphizations of natural things. See, this one's called anamos because it's a wind. And that means it's someone making a wind into a living being. And Plato actually makes a very similar remark in the Phaedrus, that we make a thing that has a body and therefore must live and die into an immortal being, that is, into a god. So but for the level of the philosophers, we're dealing, there is no supernatural in that sense, unless we get to the metaphysics.
Thank you.
Okay. So that brings us to this very important chapter. So book 1, chapter 2, and book 3, chapter 6. Actually 6, 7, and 8, I want to discuss, just given the time, I'll discuss them, and then we'll read through chapter 9, which is, I think, very helpful for understanding this distinction between the ancients and the moderns. I'll just go through chapter 6, and then we'll have a break. So I've mentioned before that what is shared by the classical Greek philosophers is the notion that what's decisive about any political community is what they call its form. It's the regime it is. So the political community is the polis, The regime or the character of it is the politeia. And the regime is the character of those who rule the city, because they set the tone for the whole city. So, and this is the peculiar centrality of politics for classical philosophy. Now, we've substituted for that culture. We think that culture is prior and politics is either derivative from culture, or politics is the arena within which various cultures compete for priority. But the classical view is that what we would call culture or society is an expression of whoever rules and then sets the tone for the whole society. And whoever rules, that's the regime. Now, the regime, all regimes, all ruling bodies posit that there are some things that are just and some things that are unjust implicitly. So, for example, the rule of the many, democracy, posit that equality is just. But they all, and they are simultaneously positing that a certain way of life leads to human happiness. Now, the way modern political science looks at this is it ignores that opinion. And it merely looks at, well, how does your oligarchy or your democracy or your monarchy distribute power and or wealth and so on. That is, it ignores the beginning point of Aristotle, which is that each kind of regime makes a claim about the good life. And his teaching begins from the fact that life is naturally good. And he gives the example that why do people struggle greatly, even when they're in the desperate circumstances, to live? And he says, because life has a certain natural sweetness. So we want to live nobly or beautifully by nature. And that means, because he takes that to be the ground of his political science, then he's going to look at the competing visions of what a good life is, instead of just eliminating all that and saying, I'm going to look at how they distribute offices or whatever it is, or their healthcare policies. Okay. Now, in this initial chapter, in chapter 6, where he discusses that character, and I've really interpreted that. I invite you to look at it and see, you may well come to a very different interpretation, but that's my interpretation of that passage. So the kinds of rule basically are mastery, that is the rule that correlates to slavery, household management, which is the rule of parents over children, and in the patriarchal society that Aristotle partly endorses and partly undercuts, the rule of husband over wife. So in book 1, he says the rule between men and women is political. That is, that ought to mean that they rule and rule in turn. But then he says that, but it's permanently aristocratic. So one person rules and the other is ruled. And yeah, he makes a joke about a reference to Herodotus that completely undercuts that suggestion. But in any case, household management and then political rule, where there is some kind of equality between citizens. Those are the 3 fundamental kinds, and that informs the next chapter where he discusses the regime more closely. Now, the fundamental difference in regimes is that the ruling body, the authoritative part of the regime, rules for its own good, or they rule for the good of the whole. If they rule for their own good, then that makes them like the kind of rule that people have over slaves, and that's unjust. If they rule for the common good, that accords with the fact that citizens have, at least in some aspects, equality, even if it's only the fact that they're equally citizens. They should have some rights that are equally respected, and therefore there is a common good. So that's the basic understanding of political rule, which, again, really only comes to fruition in Greece. I'm open to exceptions, but I don't think it came out anywhere else until it came to light in Greece, along with tragedy and philosophy. Okay, so that's chapter 6. And then we'll get into 7 and 8, where he discusses the kinds, and we can do that after a break. So shall we come back at 7:10 and dive into the articulation of the kinds of regimes?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. I'll speak to you at 10 past. I have the impression that even though we've covered 3 pages of text, that we went fairly quickly through some of those ideas. So I'd be very happy to slow down, re-examine some, because this course is meant to be the annual introduction to political philosophy with a particular focus on various different topics, but it is meant to be introductory. So if I can explain anything further, and please interrupt at any time. If you don't want to appear on the video, you can just send a message in the chat and I'll address it there. Of course, I need to turn on the chat. There we go. Now, Aristotle's division of regimes, which has remained fundamental for many, many centuries in political philosophy, until Machiavelli, and in particular to Hobbes. And we'll look at some of what Hobbes has to say about this next week. Now, Aristotle's division between the kinds of regimes begins with a kind of logical division. Either one person is ruling, or a few, or many are. But then he modifies that over the following chapters to say, well, it's not really the few versus the many, it's the rich versus the poor. There's always going to be some people who are more well off, and there's always going to be some who are less well off. And if there happen to be a lot more who are wealthy and fewer who are poor, then it will be the rule of the rich. That's what's fundamental about oligarchy, not the number. So he starts with the logical point and then moves to the actual human context. But in general, the rich in a society tend to be few. So the number of the rulers, that is the number of people who occupy the ruling offices, that is the number of people who are the rulers according to that kind of regime. Now, if the basic difference is between a good, as he says here, correct or incorrect, that is in accordance with the natural standard, is that they rule in accord with the common good or for their own good. There's just a couple of nuances that he adds to that. So a monarchy is a ruler, a single ruler ruling for the common good. A tyrant is a single ruler who rules for their own good. An aristocracy is usually the few ruling, but it's either the best rule or they rule for what is best among the citizens. Just a small nuance to the notion of ruling for the common good. The aristocracy, a genuine aristocracy. So from Aristotle's point of view, every actual aristocracy we know of, even the best versions of it, the British aristocracy or whatever, they're more or less oligarchies, and they have some elements of aristocracy in them, some genuinely successful elements of aristocracy in them, but they also have oligarchic elements. Okay, so because it's what in modernity you would call these things ideals. Okay, so aristocracy is either the best rule or they rule for what's best for the citizens. That is, making them the best or the most virtuous. And oligarchy is when the few rule and they rule for their own good, and they are the rich, so they rule for the good of the rich. Now, the name for the kind of rule when there are many ruling, but they rule for the common good, is politeia, which is the same name for the regime as a whole. And that's not an accident. It's a suggestion that the peak version of political life is when there are many who rule, but they don't rule for the good of the many, for the good of the poor. They rule for the good of everyone who's a citizen. Now, because the virtue capable of being expressed by the many is courage or military virtue, and that happens to be the characteristic virtue of a politeia, of a republic. Now, so in this sense of the rule of the many for the common good, it's often translated as republic in this context. And the characteristic virtue of a republic is independent, is the ability to fight and be independent of other communities. Okay, so when the many rule, but they rule for the good of the poor, as opposed to anyone else, in particular, the good of the rich, that's democratia, which means something like mob rule or popular rule, the rule of the demos, as opposed to when the many rule for the good of the whole. Okay, is that reasonably clear? Is there any question about how that works?
Yeah, that's clear, Martin. Thank you. I was going to say that even when you have whatever sort of regime you have, including a democracy, there are, of course, always going to be differences between people. And I guess that is one of the reasons why Aristotle tends to think that a mixed sort of regime is better. Is that right?
Yeah, so this chapter 9, I'm going to just say, which is hopefully addressing your suggestion, and also hopefully summarizing what happens in chapter 9, but it's nothing like what he says in it. So this is an interpretation, which you are free, of course, to reject for your own interpretation. But what he begins by saying in this chapter is that just as every regime expresses a certain view of justice, in fact, it's founded on a certain view of justice. So democracy is founded on the notion that every citizen is equal. Whereas oligarchy is founded on the notion that people are unequal and they should have unequal honors and unequal power. And if you contribute more money, if you have more money, then you're more important to the city and you should have more power. And that's the principle of oligarchy. Now, in this chapter, he articulates those two understandings of justice and then goes on to talk about what would constitute a proper community and its proper end, which is an inculcation of civil or political virtue. Now, what is going on without him saying it is that he is saying, well, there are three basic principles of justice: equality, or equality but in proportion with the unequal amounts of wealth that we have or property, or excellence or virtue. And that's the authoritative one. So then when he ends up, as Chris has mentioned, he ends up talking about not the best city that we could understand, the best city conceptually or ideally or according to our wishes, but the best city that you're probably going to get. And it's a mix of oligarchy and democracy. It's got oligarchic and democratic elements, but it also has some kind of an interest in inculcating excellence into people. So it's this third principle of justice that for him is the most important. And that's what is brought out in this chapter. That is the missing element from the oligarchy and democracy that needs to be injected into it if you're going to have a genuinely excellent political community. So that's what I think is going on in this chapter, and I think we'll just read through it because I think it's very rich in its implications and argumentation, and very helpful for the contrasting view we'll begin to examine next week. So he says it's necessary first to grasp what they speak of as the defining principles of oligarchy and democracy, and what justice is from both oligarchic and democratic points of view. For all fasten, everyone has a certain conception of justice, but they proceed only to a certain point and do not speak of the whole of justice in its authoritative sense. Now, my suggestion is justice in the authoritative sense is to give unequal rights to what is unequal in excellence and to encourage every citizen to be excellent. That's the authoritative sense of justice. I just suggest this on the basis of things that are said later in this chapter. But what he is saying is that most cities are democratic or oligarchic, and so they're based either on equality or inequality based upon property. And that, he is saying, that's only a part of justice. They do get part of the truth. Every political community that articulates its principles gets hold of some aspect of the truth. And that's that's why Aristotle's procedure is entirely contrary to the procedure of modern political science, because he begins internally from the examination of the worth of the opinion of every regime. He doesn't reject that and say, I know best. There are, I don't know, liberal regimes, and then everything else is authoritarian, and I just apply this template against everything, because then you can't justify yourself. From what point of view did you arrive at your understanding? His is a genuinely philosophical and searching perspective, which is we begin from an internal examination of the opinions that actual regimes have. So, yeah. For example, justice is held to be equality, and that's democracy. And he says, and it is, right? But for equals and not for all. So justice, yeah. So you should be treated equally where you were equal, but not in other respects. Why? Because people differ in excellence, and we want to encourage the attainment of excellence. Second, and inequality is held to be just, and is, right? So the fact that people can be unequal, should be treated unequally, that's true. But, and he says, so inequality is held to be just, and is indeed, but for unequals and not for all. But they disregard this element of persons and judge badly. So what he means is that, yeah, if people are unequal in excellence, then they can be justly treated unequally. But they disregard the person and they judge in terms of property. So this is the oligarchs. They say justice is inequality because it depends on how much wealth you have. Because if you're wealthy, you're supplying the naval ships, you're sponsoring the tragedies and comedies, you're contributing more, and therefore you deserve to have more power. And Aristotle says that's true, but it's not money. Money is not the difference, right? Okay, so but each grasp an aspect of the truth. So he says that the cause of this, the cause that people judge badly, is that the judgment concerns themselves, and most people are bad judges concerning their own things. So Aristotle steps in to act as neutral arbiter, but from the point of view of wanting to know what's true and what's best in each of these partial opinions.
So he would be an advocate then for scoring in junior footy games rather than everyone wins.
Yes, scoring is back in immediately.
Yeah.
Yes. And there's only one trophy, I'm afraid. There's only one one boy or girl of the match. It's just how it is. He's not quite at the Spartan level.
Better and better.
Yeah. Okay, so, and since justice is for certain persons and is distinguished in the same manner with respect to objects and for persons, as was said previously in the discourses on ethics. So in the Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about distributive and proportionate justice. We don't have to go into the details. They agree as to the equality of the object, but dispute about it for persons. I say, so what we'll get for that is the oligarchs and the democracies differ about why people should be treated unequally or equally, in a way that we don't do when we talk about the proportion of money that you should get from a contract or something. Okay, so they do this particularly because of what was just spoken of, and they judge badly with respect to what concerns themselves. So the rich overvalue wealth, and the democratic citizen overvalues being a democratic citizen. But also because both, by speaking to a point of a kind of justice, consider themselves to be speaking of justice simply. So that's almost a repetition of what he said above. Democratic and oligarchic notions of justice are not justice as a whole, they're partial perspectives. So for the ones, if they are unequal in a certain thing, such as goods, suppose they are unequal generally. So the wealthy suppose that by having more land, they are better human beings and therefore deserve more. While the others suppose that if they are equal in a certain thing, such as freedom or citizenship, then they're equal in everything. But of the most authoritative thing, they say nothing. And so this is what I'm suggesting is the point of this chapter. He's going to introduce what should be the most authoritative point of justice in the community. For if it were for the sake of possessions that they shared and joined together, they would take part in the city just to the extent that they did in property, so that the argument of the oligarchs might be held a strong one. For, the oligarchs would say, it is not just for one who has contributed 1 mina, not a lot of money, to share equally in 100 minas with the one giving all the rest, whether he comes from those who were there originally or the later arrivals. So that's the argument of the oligarchs. It's not just that someone who contributes largely to the wealth of a city to have an equal share in the offices of the city. Now, that would be, the argument would have more point if we entered into a city for the sake of preserving our possessions, which is exactly what John Locke says. We enter into a city for the sake of the preservation of our property. Our first property is our body. So we want to protect our body from violent harm. Then we want to protect the fruit of the labor of our body, that is our property. So we fundamentally enter into society for the sake of our property. So here is a point, again, like the suggestion before about nature, where Aristotle is very clearly in diametrical opposition with the moderns. So, but if the city exists not only for the sake of living, that is self-preservation, but rather primarily for the sake of living well, for otherwise there could be a city of slaves or of animals. As things are, there isn't, since they do not partake in happiness or in living in accordance with intentional choice. So again, that's a long parenthesis, so I'll just try and explicate it a little. He begins from the human being in their best condition. So there are unfortunate people who are in the radically unjust position of being slaves or serfs or held down by or oppressed by others in some other way. They aren't allowed and they aren't permitted and they probably have been denied the education to express intentional choice. So only a human being, as opposed to a rabbit, can express intentional choice by doing what is just, even though it harms them, or doing what is courageous, even though they lose something in the process, and so on. So these intentional choices, living in accord with these human ends, are not possible for people who are oppressed, and they're not possible for animals. He's not reducing the oppressed people to animals. These are two different categories of people who are denied the peculiar character of human happiness. Okay, so political community in the decisive sense is not possible for those people or for animals, but the city is not primarily for the sake of just being alive, it's for the sake of living well. And then he goes on, and if the city does not exist for the sake of an alliance to prevent their suffering injustice from anyone, nor for purposes of exchanges, prevention of injustice and trade and use of one another, for otherwise the Tyrrhenians and the Carthaginians and all who have arrangements with one another would be as citizens of one city. Now there's another long parenthesis. At any rate, there are compacts between them concerning imports, agreements to abstain from injustice, and treaties of alliance. Now, that's a long negative. If the city existed just for the sake of life, then it would be adequate just to have a treaty and an agreement, a treaty so that you could trade with one another and you could prevent injustice against one another. Now, that is also what the moderns say. We form a social contract to prevent harm and to facilitate trade. Excuse me, let's have to shut a door. Oh no. Okay. So again, this is a nice contrast with the moderns. And so he says, and this is, I'll just indicate where I'm reading from. So, but no officers. So he's talking about these two different ancient communities, the Tyrrhenians and the Carthaginians. And Carthage is of particular interest to Aristotle because it's one of the three cities in his mind that are the best that have ever existed. And because they had some care for the excellence of the citizens, they had institutions that he thought were just and so on. Now here he's pointing out that the people in Carthage had an agreement, a compact, an alliance with the people in another city and they traded together. They had mutually respected each other's laws, so they wouldn't do injustice against one another. What he's saying is that that's not a city in itself, the fact that they have this alliance. So, but no officers common to all have been established to deal with these things, but different ones in each city. Nor do those of one city take thought that the others should be of a certain quality, that is, they should have human excellence or not, or that none of those coming under the compacts should be unjust or depraved in any way, but only that they should not act unjustly toward one another. So the people in Carthage don't care if the people in Tyre are courageous, moderate, just, generous, and so on. They just want to trade with them and not be harmed by one another. And Aristotle is trying to argue that that, for him, falls short of being what a genuine political community would be. So to go on at sentence 8 here, whoever takes thought for good governance, and the law, the word is eunomia. So nomos is the Greek word for law. Eunomia, the prefix, is an adverb meaning something's in a good condition. So it's usually translated, this phrase is normally translated as lawfulness or law-abidingness or having good laws, right? Whoever takes thought for having good laws and having people obey the laws, however, gives careful attention to political vice and virtue. So the intention of the law is to inculcate excellence as well as prohibit vice, whereas our laws are all on the prohibition side. We don't have the positive laws. And we would experience such positive laws as tyrannizing over our individual freedom. And that shows you that the beginning point to this understanding is quite different. So whoever takes thought for eunomia, for lawfulness and for having good laws, however, gives careful attention to political virtue and vice. Political virtue and vice, because a polis can't produce philosophical virtue or genuinely human virtue and vice. That's not a political possibility. There's always this tension between the virtue of the human being and the virtue of the citizen. It is thus evident that virtue must be a care for every city. Now, so if there's something from tonight that strikes you or that you want to recall, I think that's a very helpful phrase. It is thus evident that virtue must be a care for every city, because that's the opposite of the modern situation, which is that the city is for the sake of our preservation, and then virtue is for the sake of the preservation of the city. Right? It's not that the city is intended to inculcate virtue for the sake of the individual. Okay. It is thus evident that virtue must be a care for every city, or at least every one to which the term applies truly and not merely in a manner of speaking. So this is what I am saying, that this chapter is about 3 principles of justice. This is the third. A genuine political community cares for the excellence of its citizen, because that's its central point. The conditions for life have to be taken care of. If you can't preserve your life against your enemies, if you can't preserve your laws against corruption by external or internal powers, then you'll lose a political community. But those are the conditions. The point of it is to inculcate political virtue and vice, and then you might have a political community, properly speaking, from Aristotle's point of view. For otherwise, the city becomes an alliance, which differs from alliances of remote allies like Carthage and Tyre, only by location, and law becomes a compact and, as the sophist Lycophron said, a guarantor among one another of the just things, but not the sort of things to make the citizens good and just. So you preserve So, and that's exactly what the modern social contract teaching is. That it's an alliance. You make a social contract not to harm others, and they will respect other people, will respect your rights not to be harmed. So it's fundamentally negative. It deals with the conditions of life and not the end of life. And this thought that you could have a city that was devoted to the means to life and its preservation and not the end, Obviously, that thought was available. It was available to Lycophron and available to Aristotle, and Aristotle rejects it. Okay, but that the matter stands thus is evident. Well, Aristotle in many of his books says that this is clear and that is manifest. Well, this is evident, and it requires an enormous amount of explication of his rather knotty prose. For even if one were to bring the locations together into one, so that the city of the Megarians were fastened to that of the Corinthians by walls, it would still not be a single city. Okay, so sharing a location is, again, that's a condition of a city, but it doesn't make a city. Nor would it if they practiced intermarriage with one another, although this is one of the shared things that are peculiar to cities. And he's going to make a comment later about the intermarriage as being one of the signs of affection which is necessary for a city. So you can't just have a social contract with everyone in your political community. You must have positive affection, and that is expressed by things like intermarriage. And so, yeah, multiculturalism is not something high on his list of things to aim at. So, nor similarly, if certain persons dwelled in separate places, yet were not so distant as to have nothing in common, but had laws not to commit injustice toward one another in their transactions. For example, if one were a carpenter, one a farmer, one a shoemaker, one something else of this sort, and they were 10,000 in number, yet had nothing in common except things of this sort, technical knowledge, and then exchange and an alliance for self-preservation. Not even in this way would there be a city. What then is the reason for this? Okay, so then we have the development of part of the justification for this way of thinking and for this third authoritative element, which is the authoritative understanding of justice. It is surely not on account of a lack of proximity of the community. For even if they join together while sharing in this way, but each nevertheless treated his own household as a city and each other as if there were a defensive alliance merely for assistance against those committing injustice, it would not by this fact be held a city by those studying the matter precisely. That is, by those of us who possess the Aristotelian analysis of political community and therefore have the precise analysis. There is not genuinely a city if you merely have the defensive alliance against having injustice committed against one. If that is, they shared in a similar way when joined together as they had when separated. Right. Anything thus far, please interrupt at any point or send a message. Actually, I can't see the messages while I'm sharing screen. So yeah, please shout. It is evident, therefore, that the city is not a community sharing our location and for the sake of not committing injustice against each other and conducting trade. So again, that's a very good sentence to contrast with the moderns. These things must necessarily be present if there is to be a city. So these things are the condition for a city. You share a location, you prevent injustice being committed against one another, and you share trade. These are the conditions of a city. But not even when all of them are there, all of them are present, is it yet a city. But the city is the community in living well, both of households and families, for the sake of a complete and self-sufficient life. And so this is the expression complete and self-sufficient recurs in chapter 7 of book 1 of the Ethics, which is a really important chapter for the ethics, where he's trying to find what is the clue to human happiness. And he says, well, it would have to be something that's complete. You know, you don't lack anything else, because you don't say, well, I'm happy if only I had $10,000 more, and self-sufficient. And there occurs a famous sentence in that chapter where he says, by self-sufficient, I don't mean, you've got enough wealth by yourself, but you have a spouse, children, and fellow citizens. So self-sufficient in the sense of living in a communal life. And then when he searches for, well, what would make a human being live a complete and self-sufficient life, he says, well, let's look at their ergon, their activity or work. And he says, well, what's specific to human beings? It's not that we nourish ourselves because we share that with plants and animals. It's not that we have sense perception because we share that with the animals. It's the fact that we have speech or reason, logos. So again, very similar argument to the one he makes in chapter 2 of book 1 of the Politics. The species-specific character of human beings is that they have speech, and therefore their excellence, their activity, their characteristic activity, and therefore their excellence would involve speech or reason. So activities in accord with speech or reason would be expressions of human excellence. And then he goes on to discuss the ethical and intellectual expressions of human excellence. So yeah, there's this little linguistic echo in his use of the expression complete and self-sufficient. Okay, so the city is the community in living well. So it must embody institutions and opinions and practices and pastimes that express human excellence and happiness, that are not therefore merely negative laws protecting the elements of the city. This will not be possible, however, unless they inhabit one and the same location and make use of intermarriage. So those are conditions, they're not the end. It was on this account that marriage connections arose in cities, as well as, so what also arose were clans or tribes, festivals, and the pastimes of living together. So he's just said that it's living well that constitutes the city. And the pastimes of living together, although they may be local to a particular clan or tribe, like Athens had 8 tribes, and they all have different histories and traditions and gave emphasis to different gods and so on and so forth. And there are also larger city events in which each tribe, well, for example, at the comedies and the tragedies, there will be a judge from each tribe to judge the work of art at the end of it, and so on. And in the assemblies and so on, you would have representatives from each tribe, so they would come together for these larger city things. And the festivals and the pastimes, these are quite important to his understanding of what living together means. We use the term holiday, so that's time off from work. Obviously, etymologically, holiday means like a holy day, so a day dedicated to God. Now, in the Greek context, that's actually quite similar. The pastimes and the festivals are activities that take place under the auspices of a god. So Dionysus is the god of the theatre, and so when the tragedies are presented and the comedies are presented, it's under the auspices of a celebration of the god Dionysus. And there are many other festivals. And so when the pastimes, it's not like for us, a pastime, I was going to say might be collecting stamps, but there are no such thing as stamps. Are there still stamps? Anyway, there's email. I don't know if apparently there are still stamps. But he means those activities of living together which cultivate the highest human excellences, such as writing, acting in, and observing a tragedy by Sophocles. So he doesn't mean the Real Wives of Melbourne or whatever those shows are, which I'm afraid I may have missed. Okay, so this sort of thing is the work of affection. You can't come together and produce works of art without mutual affection and desire. It's not an alliance. Right? For affection is the intentional choice of living together. And I'm down to there. So living well, then, is the end of the city. And the end, yeah, I don't want to say purpose, because things have ends but don't have purposes. For example, the end of a foal, of a small horse, is to grow into a large horse, and the end of a seed is to grow into a tree. That's not a purpose. The seed doesn't think, well, I plan someday to have large green foliage and so forth. That's a purpose. The end is the completion of a thing. So the end of the city, the fulfillment of a city, the best character of a city, is living well together. And these things, the pastimes that people undertake together, are for the sake of that end. So a city is the community, the sharing, the partnership of families and villages in a complete and self-sufficient life. So again, complete and self-sufficient is almost a code for what he calls in the ethics, the life dedicated to human happiness. And the clue to human happiness is virtue. That is the exercise of our particular human characteristics, and that is the capacity for speech and reason. This, we assert, is living happily and nobly. He translates it finely, which is fine, but happily. And so kalos means noble, or nobly, or beautifully. So, and this is, the noble is not the same as the happy. So I'm going to insert a large interpretive suggestion, but human beings by nature desire the good. The good, the complete good, the self-sufficient good is human happiness. The political community aims at political virtue, so it aims at what Aristotle in the ethics calls secondary happiness. It can't aim at the primary happiness because that's private. It aims at the communal, the happiness that is possible for the person in a community, and that is more noble than good. So courage is more, and justice, they are more, they're still good for you to do. Aristotle describes them as being, it's better to be courageous, even when it costs you something, like a limb, than to be cowardly. It's better in one way and worse in another, but it's better to be virtuous than vicious. But those things are noble. They're not simply good, right? And that's what the city aims at. Okay, so the political community must be regarded, therefore, as being for the sake of noble actions, not for the sake of just self-preservation or living together in that sense. Hence, those who contribute most to the community of this sort have a greater part in the city than those who are equal or greater in freedom and dissent, but unequal in political virtue, or those who outdo them in wealth, but are outdone in virtue. Now, that's I'll go over this sentence because to me, that's the key to what he's tried to establish in this chapter. Those who contribute most to a community of this sort have a greater part of the city than those who are equal or greater in freedom and dissent. So birth and freedom, that is citizens who can trace their descent back, or who are citizens and therefore equal and free, right? But who are unequal in political virtue. So the more political virtue you have, the more place you ought to have by nature. That's the standard, right? And descent, that is your birth, and merely being a citizen are not superior to that standard. So that's against democratic virtue and birth on the one hand, or those who outdo them in wealth but are outdone in virtue on the other hand. So against the democratic view that because we are equal as citizens, we are therefore equal in all respects. He says, no, we are more or less equal in participating in excellence and nobility. And then against the oligarchs who say, well, the proportion of wealth you have, that's your proportion that's the degree to which you contribute to the city, and you therefore deserve more from the city and deserve to have more power. And he is saying, no, being outdone in wealth is not relevant, not the relevant criteria. The relevant criteria is outdoing people in excellence, in being just, courageous, liberal, and so on. Now, so yeah, to me, that's the clue. That's the clue to understanding how to divide this chapter into its three main thoughts: the three principles of justice of a democracy, oligarchy, and then what he takes to be the authoritative sense of justice, which you can't easily and simply legislate for a city, but should be the authoritative end of the city. So then he says that all who dispute about regimes speak of some part of justice then is evident from what has been said. So what he's attempting to claim is that there is some element of truth in both the democratic and the oligarchic way of understanding justice, but he proceeds through to the end of those perspectives to arrive at what he thinks is the precise or true meaning of justice, which is that it's relative to political virtue. Okay, so that's a very dense chapter, but I think it's extremely helpful for understanding the point of departure for the moderns, because they're disagreeing with this and they're disagreeing with that second chapter, which teaches that human beings are by nature political. Any questions about this chapter that I can address?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. That was really good. So just one question. So this last part of the discussion seems to be basically about a polis, because it's all about the city. And so you've got then these different types of regimes. And I think you were saying earlier, making comments about the size of the different regimes. So am I right in saying that his view is that really to have the best city, if it get like the larger the city becomes, the more unlikely it is that you can have the kind of excellences that he said should be the aspiration for any political system.
Yes, it's not possible. It's not possible to have certain kinds of excellence in a large nation state. Now, immediately, but he is saying this is the standard, and a nation state can still inculcate several kinds of political virtue. It's not impossible, but what it requires is precisely what we're killing off in the last century, which is local associations. And de Tocqueville has a lot of comment on why he thought the American democracy would be successful and was successful thus far. And it was because of the strength of the local associations. And you still have that in the US to some degree. So people elect their local sheriff, they elect the local school board, they elect the local mayor, and their police force only worked. For example, I was in a suburb we would call it a suburb. They call it a city, part of a larger metropolis, but it's governed in Brookline. So there's a Brookline sheriff and a Brookline mayor and a Brookline city council, and there's a Brookline police force of 12 officers. Because it's Brookline, or the grass is neatly mown, if your car doesn't start, the police will turn up. In the next suburb, over in Rochester, the police won't turn up because they're afraid of being shot at. So it's a completely different atmosphere, and you cross the road and there's rubbish everywhere. And so the advantage of this is that if people want to be, they can be involved in the governing of their own life in their political community. And that was what de Tocqueville admired. The disadvantage is that sometimes it perpetuates injustice. So the schools are bad. No one wants to go there to work as a teacher. They're underfunded because the tax revenue for that city in Rochester or Brockton is very low. So they can't get good equipment and good teachers and so on. And so it tends to perpetuate injustice. But that's a way in which a large nation state can replicate the kind of political excellence that Aristotle is discussing.
Martin, would it be fair to say that Aristotle believes that humans are capable of more virtue, more nobility than the moderns do?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, there's these two steps in the ethics. The first line of the ethics is, it was beautifully said, and he means by Plato, that everyone desires the good. So we all desire what's good. And he starts from the point of view, we all desire what's good for ourselves. Well, what's the comprehensive good? Happiness. So how do we become happy? Well, it's not just pleasure, because there are good and bad pleasures. So there's a standard outside pleasure.
Martin, for about 20 seconds or 25 seconds, you froze there.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I just had a warning just come up about. I'll just repeat myself. So, yeah. So in the ethics, he begins by saying, every human being desires what is good for themselves. The comprehensive good is happiness, and that's not just wealth, because wealth is just an instrument to other goods. It's not pleasure, because there are good and bad pleasures. So there's a standard outside of what just pleases us, what we think we want, and of wealth, of happiness. And he argues that, well, it's the proper exercise of our human faculties. And the word for that is virtue. So that's the end. So there's two steps, happiness, and then virtue is the key to happiness. Now, therefore, the city is for the sake of people acting virtuously, that is for the sake of their happiness. Whereas for the moderns, the city is for the sake of the preservation of you seeking your own good. And
You
so
just go back to Plato's necessary and unnecessary desires.
yes, except in the moderns, there are no unnecessary desires.
Yes, they're all equal.
Yes, exactly. So what we've done is institute what Plato suggests is the danger of the democratic city, that it can dissipate and become an insistent that there is no difference between desires.
Yeah.
And now we get many arguments that there is no difference from Locke onwards. It's not a recent thing, although we are now witnessing the extreme of that. Like, it doesn't matter what bizarre desire you have, like the woman in France who married a bridge, it doesn't matter. It must be treated equally as other desires. Yeah. I just read the other day that there are some girls at the sister school to the high school I went to, a number of them who have decided that they are cats, and they proceed on all fours and they groom themselves and so on. So like that's when you take that seriously and say, well, now we have a cat room for the cat people to feel safe in, and we've got bowls of water and so on. When you proceed to that level, what you were saying is there are no natural standards, and pleasure, the individual inclination, is the only standard. But that dissipates everything, and it dissipates, as Socrates indicated, the distinction between animal and human. So once you say that pleasure is the standard, as Hobbes and Locke do, ultimately, and it's taken hundreds of years to get here, but ultimately you won't be able to justify a specifically human versus a specifically animal life.
Yeah, it's just incredible. I mean, there was a man who was appointed to a senior position in the Nuclear Material Control Authority in America, who's publicly says he enjoys bestiality, and you can say that now publicly in some places, and people say, oh well, what you do. But my comment, I think it also happened in Plato, but twice in this chapter 9 he refers to how difficult it is to be a judge in your own cause, and that is something that is everyone in whatever sort of political system can recognize. That you just have to be a human being to recognize that. And we think of when everywhere on earth, it's only in the most extremely authoritarian countries and totalitarian countries that it's otherwise, or in a democracy where there's corruption, of course. And it's remarkable that idea has been expressed so long ago.
Yes, but it's also telling that he doesn't say, well, people are just selfish, and they rationalize their selfishness by projecting a understanding of justice in the world. He doesn't do that. His proceeding is very Platonic, in which this perspective is a partial perspective on the truth, and we're going to dig out what's true in it while we seek for the more comprehensive truth that it is a part of. And that's the classical perspective stemming from the Socratic turn in philosophy. Whereas the modern turn is to say, everyone's acting self-interestedly, acting in accord with their self-interest, and we can manipulate those passions to get the best result for the system as a whole. That there'll be peace, say, or these quite necessary goods, but it's a different procedure. It doesn't look at the opinions that people express and begin from there.
Martin, the girls who think they're cats, I assume in that jurisdiction they must be desexed unless they're breeders.
I think it's up to their own inclination. So
Okay.
yeah.
On a more serious note, is there a recommended or definitive history of political philosophy that you'd recommend?
There is an excellent volume of essays. So we're reading an essay by Leo Strauss in the last discussion. And he and his students published a book called The History of Political Philosophy, which consists of about 35 essays on every figure. And they're all good. They're all good. The PhD supervisor of my PhD, Stanley Rosen, wrote the chapter on Spinoza in that book. And it's in its third edition, and you get the older ones, you get different versions of some of the essays, but that's an excellent overview of every major political philosopher. We've actually arrived at 8. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stick around, but I'll just turn off the recording.